everyone. It's great to be here with you all at Next. Thanks for coming out on this last Friday morning. Really exciting.
If you had a late night, we hope you had at least one cup of coffee. We're going to try to bring the energy to compensate.
We're really excited to talk about agentic commerce with you all today, what it is, why it matters, and really what to do about it over the next 12 to 18 months.
I'm here with my colleague Hannah. We're both partners at McKinsey & Company. We spend most of our time with consumer and technology companies who are all asking the same question. How will AI agents change shopping, and where should we place our bets?
I'll leave you with Roger for now to discuss our experiences with organizations, and I'll be back in a few minutes to share more about where we see the evolution of agentic commerce going.
Thanks, Hannah. Let me start with the 5 key messages we invite you to take away today. First of all, there is a very real impact opportunity here, on the order of trillions, not billions of dollars. Second, the customer experience is being fundamentally reshaped from clicks to conversations. And consumers are already there. Behavior has shifted faster than most merchant roadmaps, and expectations for seamless experiences are increasing. And so we see that most merchants, they see the opportunity, but there's a gap between expectations and investment today. This will not be a slow linear shift. The time to act is now, and those who do will have a chance to emerge as the leaders of this new era. We're going to come back to these at the end, but let's start by unpacking that impact opportunity. So, if you think back to previous shifts in commerce, like the early days of the internet, the mobile revolution, or more recently, the shift to social commerce, those fundamentally changed the way people shop. Let's go back in time, though, to 1999. There were only 100 million users, just under 2% of the global population that were online, mostly on dial-up, mostly on desktops, at home, waiting for that page to load. In the 2000s, you type a URL, go make a coffee, and maybe the page is there when you get back. It did not mean this. It did not mean having your entire internet in your pocket, available when you're walking to the train, sitting in an airport, or let's be honest, sometimes half listening in a meeting that could have been an email. In the world we lived in those days, we just weren't as connected. And these shifts, mobile, web, and now agentic commerce, created new winners. And they also created significant upheavals in the competitive landscape. And that spanned across many categories of commerce. When we look at this today, we see 5 billion agentically empowered shoppers, over 2/3 of the global population. They're online, and in many markets, the smartphone penetration is 80% or higher. Being online is constant, it's mobile, and it's embedded in all of your daily lives. Agentic commerce is being built on the foundations of all of these prior mobile and web revolutions. And as a result, it can scale and move even faster. And so what we see is that the only thing that's truly holding it back is the shift in consumer behavior. That's why we estimate that even in our moderate scenario, we will see $3 to $5 trillion of agent-mediated B2C commerce by around 2030. That is a structural change in how and where consumer intent is expressed, captured, and interpreted. And of course, this is a shift in the interface to the consumer. Over the last 2 decades, we've seen a steady push toward more personalization and less friction. Think one-click checkouts, buy online, pick up in store, autofill, and recommendation carousels, on and on. And now with generative and agentic AI, we are moving into a world where the systems don't just support decisions, they increasingly make them, especially for repetitive or lower risk choices. And that's happening today. And it's happening in two places. First is a general purpose agent. For many of us, they're already part of our daily lives. Tools like Gemini, Google AI Overviews, Claude, ChatGPT, Perplexity, others are helping us with our day-to-day tasks, our questions, and our shopping. They're not tied to a single retailer. They sift and they synthesize the internet for the consumer. You might say something like, I need a new pair of running shoes for the San Francisco Marathon in July. Under $200, good for steep hills, uneven terrain, and I care about sustainability. The agent doesn't care which site you go to. It cares about fulfilling that intent. Within seconds, it surfaces a handful of options, compares trade-offs, and does that job for you. The second are agentic capabilities embedded directly into retail environments. You see Magic Apron from Home Depot to our right. Instead of a search bar and a filter menu, you have a conversational interface that understands intent, it navigates a catalog, it applies promotions, it manages loyalty, it coordinates fulfillment rules. This is not a chatbot on steroids, it's a completely different interaction model that moves us from keyword search to intent or use case-based fulfillment. That intent can be multimodal, meaning it can start with a picture or a spoken phrase, and we're really seeing strong momentum. So at NRF and other forums earlier this year, new protocols and standards came out, from trusted agent IDs to the Universal Commerce Protocol, UCP, from Google that attracted a lot of attention as ways to get agents and merchants transacting more safely and more profitably together. Many retailers have since committed to hopping on the train and are moving full steam ahead. They're experimenting, and so are the consumers. So now let's take a bit of a different example. On a recent trip, I was in New York back in January, NRF time, and I realized I'd underpacked for the weather. I needed a jacket that was warm enough for walking outside, still looked decent for the meetings, and I needed it to be delivered that day to my hotel. Instead of browsing 10 different sites, I opened a conversational experience and described all that in one prompt. Warm, business casual, under $300, delivered 5 p.m., this address. And within seconds, I had a short list that met those constraints with size recommendations based on past purchases. No filter gymnastics, no jumping across tabs. It was faster, more direct, and far less effort. That's the shift. Fewer clicks, more conversations, less hunting, more deciding. So those are the two experience types. Let's bring my colleague Hannah back to look at what's actually happening behind the scenes.
Thanks, Roger. So far, we've looked at the front-end experience. From the user's perspective, it's quite simple. There's a person interacting with a general purpose or a merchant-owned agent. What's equally interesting is what really happens behind the scenes. We think about 3 main scenarios. Let's unpack each of these 3 scenarios one by one. The first is what we would call agent to site. This is where most of the activity is happening today. Your agent is essentially navigating a web that was built for humans. It's going to websites, it's pulling information, it's comparing options, and then it's either bringing that back to you or, in some cases already, executing on your behalf. The second scenario is agent to agent. This is where things start to shift more fundamentally and where it gets interesting. Instead of your agent interacting with websites, it interacts directly with other agents. For example, your personal agent like Gemini can interact with various merchants' online storefronts. Places like Walmart's agent to stock your home essentials, Macy's agent to help you find an outfit, or Expedia's agent to help you book your next trip. Over time, this then starts to look like a web of pages, and less like a web of pages and actually more like a web of agents, where information is exchanged directly and transactions are negotiated programmatically. Now, when that happens, you also start to see new types of intermediaries emerge. Agents that sit in between and coordinate across multiple providers. In some ways, taking on roles that marketplaces or aggregators play today, which is why, interestingly, many marketplace players are both very active in this space and somewhat exposed. Now, the third model is what we would call multi-agent or orchestrated commerce, the agent-to-broker scenario. This is where your agent is not just interacting with one other agent, but really coordinating across many. So instead of a single transaction, it's assembling and executing across multiple vendors all at once, and some of these vendors are then broker agents. So for example, building and booking an entire trip, right? Assembling flights, hotels, restaurant bookings, sightseeing tours, et cetera, say for your next trip to Barcelona, or managing multiple other services of whichever kind under one mandate. Now, one important point, these models are not sequential. We don't go from 1 to 2 to 3. This doesn't happen in a straight line. They will all exist in parallel. And they will coexist with something else as well, humans. Even in our projections, 80+% of transactions in 2030 will still involve humans directly interacting with websites and apps. So this is not a world of humans or agents. It's always going to be a world of humans and agents. And that does have important implications because it means companies need to be ready for both. Now, with that in mind, let's look at how this evolves in terms of levels of autonomy and delegation that consumers do ascribe to agentic commerce. Now, building on what we just discussed, let me introduce a framework that we published and developed and that has quite resonated with many of our clients. And this is really a way to think about the future of agentic shopping and commerce. We like to think about this not just as a curve of automation or a staircase, as you can see here, but also really a curve of consumer delegation. And that distinction is important because it's not just about technology being pushed onto consumers. The consumer will always remain in the driver's seat. Rather, what changes is how much they choose to delegate to the agent and how much autonomy they choose to grant to the agent. So if you look at this spectrum, you'll see 6 levels. Starting at the bottom of the curve, level 0, this is what we would call the pre-agentic baseline. You can think of this as subscription models, for example. Let's say, having the same coffee beans delivered automatically to your doorstep every 2 weeks or so. Sure, that's convenient, but it's not very personalized, and there's no real intelligence or adaptation. Then level 1, which we call assist. This is what really emerged around 2022 when generative AI came onto the mass market scene. This is where AI is like your cognitive sidekick, right? It helps you think through decisions. You might ask it to compare 2 products, summarize trade-offs, maybe give a recommendation. For example, as someone who travels quite a bit, I found myself losing yet another pair of my noise-canceling headphones and needing a replacement. And I needed that for my flight and didn't have time to look into this myself and compare specs, et cetera. So I asked my agent to do that for me. And within a few seconds, not only did my agent find me the best pair of high-quality noise-canceling headphones that had the longest battery life, which matters to me, but it also found me a discount. So here, really, AI was like my friend and helper. But it didn't actually act on my behalf, right? We're still in the pre-agentic zone. Now, when you move to level 2, this is where we enter what we would call the agentic territory. This is assemble. Now here, the agent starts to put things together for you. For example, building that travel itinerary for your Barcelona trip, combining the flights, the hotels, the activities, et cetera, into one ready-to-book option. Might also help you put together an outfit or your grocery shopping basket. Now, the key here is that the agent structures the decision for you, but you still approve. Then, level 3, authorize. This is where the agent begins to execute, but under quite tight supervision. You define the constraints, you define the guardrails. For example, I'll say something like, buy healthy groceries, focus on local organic produce, under X budget, and deliver to my doorstep by Saturday, 10 a.m. If those constraints are met, then the agent can go ahead and transact. If not, it's going to come back to me and ask for substitutions or whether it can go 20 bucks above budget, right? Here, I'm still very much in control, but I am starting to delegate some of the executional tasks. Level 4, autonomize. This is when we start to move to a standing mandate. So the agent knows your preferences, it knows your roles, it knows your guardrails, and it can act on your behalf without requiring confirmation every time, as long as these requirements are met. This tends to happen today in more commoditized categories, where differentiation is lower and trust is higher. So for example, one use case that I personally like to think about is, and where I'd be eager to deploy this, is making sure that I maintain my airline points and status throughout the year, especially with my preferred airline, while still getting good deals on flights, even if that means flying with a different, maybe non-preferred airline every now and then. And then finally, level 5. This is what we call the networked autonomy. And this is where agents interact with other agents. Your personal agent negotiates with brand or broker agents and can compare across providers, it can coordinate switching, and it can execute decisions within predefined mandates. So instead of you navigating to multiple platforms, the agents are now coordinating and even negotiating across the ecosystem. Now, one important thing to keep in mind as you think through what that means potentially for your business, this progression is a function of technology for sure, but it is also a function of time and trust. Looking ahead, the technology will improve. We've seen much of this week already here in Vegas. More brands and retailers will offer these capabilities. We've seen some amazing showcases already. And consumers will become more familiar, and they will increasingly feel comfortable, and therefore naturally move up the curve. But there will also be natural plateaus, because not all categories are the same. For commoditized, low-risk purchases, consumers will be more willing to delegate, right? Think about your groceries or your tennis socks. For more emotional or high-consideration categories, say luxury, consumers will likely want to remain involved, right? If I were to splurge on a handbag, I might still want some help to find something that matches my style. Okay, enter the agent, but I'd still want to decide and maybe even feel the materials in store. It just makes a difference. In this case, AI would be more like a concierge, either for me or possibly even the sales assistant in the store, who can then offer me more tailored or personalized products. Now, even as the technology evolves, full delegation will not and doesn't have to happen everywhere. And that nuance is important when you think about where you want to play and how fast you want to move. As a business, right, you need to meet your customers where they shop. And now Roger will tell you a bit more about where consumers are in their adoption journey today.
So thanks, Hannah. Let's now turn our attention back to the consumer, right? Really all starts with them. Nothing matters unless consumers adopt. And the headline here is quite simple. Consumers are already using AI, not only to improve email drafts or synthesize meeting notes, or they are already using it to shop. And in our global consumer survey from earlier in the year, 80% of consumers reported that they are actively using AI chatbots or search agents to shop. Adoption is no longer nascent. AI is already part of the shopping journey. But where in their journey they use it is very important as well. About 58% are already using AI in discovery, and that number is expected to grow to 75. So things like comparing products, exploring options, getting recommendations. This is where AI is already a thought partner. It's critical because your brand needs to appear earlier in that decision-making process, and an agent may be responsible for setting the initial consideration set. Now, if you move further along the journey into actual commerce, the numbers drop. Only about 35% are using AI to transact commerce today, although that is expected to grow to around 60%. Now, that brings us back to our earlier messaging. There's no reason to sit on the sidelines and wait. In the care stage, meaning everything that happens after you click the buy button, we see a similar pattern. About 36% of consumers are using AI for care today, and 50% expected in the future. So what's the data tell us? Consumers are today comfortable asking for help from AI. They're less comfortable in letting it spend money on their behalf, and that is a critical distinction because it reinforces something that we've been implying throughout. This is a tech shift that needs a trust shift to realize its full potential, and the adoption will follow. Opportunity is real, usage is building, but the next step moves us from assistance to delegation, and that remains to be truly unlocked. So if consumers are hesitant to delegate, the obvious question is, what actually moves them from help me to decide to go ahead and do it for me? And the answer is really straightforward. It comes down to value, specifically time and money. If you deliver savings on either of these dimensions, willingness to adopt increases significantly. If you look at financial savings, once you cross the threshold of about $60 per month, adoption jumps from everyday purchases, such as groceries or detergent, and when we get to 80%, at that level, we get to 80% of consumers saying that they will be willing to use an agentic solution. And you see a very similar pattern when it comes to time. If you can save more than in about an hour a month, over 80% are willing to delegate to agents these everyday purchases. And the thresholds increase as ticket prices also increase. So if we look at watches or handbags, to get to that 80% adoption, the savings would have to be about $100 to $200. The value exchange is clear though. If you save me time or you save me money, I'm much more willing to delegate. And we're not necessarily talking about massive shifts here, which means that the barrier to unlocking adoption might be lower than it seems. And this is important. Value alone is not enough. It gets you through the door, but sustained adoption really depends on trust. I find it helpful to think about trust and subsequent delegation models through some simple analogies. First, full replication model, your digital twin. This is an agent that mirrors me, it knows my references, my history, my behavior, and it can act exactly as I would across context. That could be powerful, but for many consumers today, it's not especially realistic, and for some, maybe not especially desirable or even scary. Second is the delegated trust model. I think of this a bit like my daughter. She's 19. She knows me pretty well. We've had a lot of conversations about trust and responsibility around the dinner table. So she knows preferences. She's got a credit card linked to my bank account, but understands that this level of trust comes with rules and responsibilities, thresholds. She operates with somewhat clear boundaries, but also a degree of freedom and interpretation of what those boundaries are. So I'm comfortable letting her act on my behalf without checking in every single time. And at the same time, if I wanted to be in the know, all I need to do is check the transaction stream. That's the middle ground where we think a lot of agentic commerce is going to land in the near term. Agents will act within some clearly defined boundaries. Humans will be in the loop and in charge. Third, a bounded model. I think of this as my beloved pet. In this case would be my dog Phoebe. I trust her, but with a very short leash. So she can roam in the backyard. She can't leave the house on her own, and she sure as heck isn't going to drive the car. But in many ways, that's where we are today with AI. We trust it with very narrow tasks, under tight supervision, and with clear constraints. But we're not ready to hand over full control. Short leash. The key question for all of us is not what is technically possible, it's what level of trust you're asking for from your consumer, and whether the trust you provide and the value you provide is high enough to justify that trust.
So we've talked about trust from the consumer perspective. Now let's look at what that means for merchants. Because if trust is the unlock for adoption on the part of consumers, as you just heard, then designing for trust becomes a core capability on the part of the merchant. And so when we break this down, there's really 5 areas that matter the most. First, similar to how in the past merchants had to KYC, know your customer, they now have to KYA, know their customer's agent. Just like you verify users today, you'll need to verify agents. Who is this agent acting on behalf of? Is it authenticated? Is it authorized to take this action? This can mean things like agent credentials or certifications, or even something like a passport that signals trust. And then for more sensitive actions, you'll need stronger controls, multi-factor authentication, clear audit trails, so that both you as the merchant and the consumer can see what happened and why. Second, put humans at the center. Because even as you automate, the human, of course, never disappears. Consumers need to feel in control. They want to feel in control. This means giving them the opportunity to override decisions where they want to, making interfaces intuitive, and building experiences that reflect their preferences and optimize for efficiency for them. Because ultimately, trust is built through functionality, consistency, tone, and how the experience feels time and again. Third, embrace transparency. Agents will increasingly make recommendations and take actions, and consumers will want to understand why. Why this product? Why this price? Why this option over another? So transparency becomes critical. Showing comparisons, explaining trade-offs, clarifying what is automated versus what requires confirmation. And also being clear about limitations, what the agent can do and really what it cannot do. Fourth, secure data. These systems will rely on quite sensitive information, and that, of course, makes data security foundational. End-to-end encryption, limiting data sharing, minimizing what you store. And, of course, always ensuring compliance with global standards as they emerge. Because one breach of trust can really set adoption back significantly, not just for an individual consumer, but across the board. And then finally, and number 5, govern responsibly. As agents act on behalf of users, accountability really becomes critical. Who's responsible if something goes wrong? How are errors being handled? What happens in cases of misrepresentation or failure? Merchants need and want clear policies, clear ownership, and alignment with regulatory expectations, of course. So stepping back, trust is not one single thing, it's a system. It's identity, control, transparency, security, and governance working together. Now, the organizations that will get this right will be the ones to unlock that next wave of adoption. Building a trust stack is key to ensure readiness, but then the question is, how ready are merchants today? And what drives and motivates them, right? We've heard about consumers, now what's on the part of the merchants? And so let's take a look at our latest research as it pertains to merchants in particular. This whole space is new, right? It's moving fast. You don't want to be on the sidelines. but you also don't want to be spraying experiments everywhere and never see impact. So let's really have a look at where merchants are today. We asked merchants about their primary goals when investing in agentic commerce. More than half pointed to efficiency and cost savings. At the same time, 54% also did cite revenue growth as a key objective. And this is quite notable. In many cases, we see the biggest opportunity for early movers, not just in efficiency, but also in capturing share, driving deeper consumer engagement, increasing frequency of interactions, and ultimately building loyalty. Over time, we expect the value narrative to shift from margin and SG&A efficiency toward growth. But that upside disproportionately will accrue to those who move early and decisively. Agentic commerce will not fundamentally change how much people consume. Human needs still ultimately anchor demand. That is not going to change. But what it will change is who captures that demand by shaping discovery, consideration, and purchase decisions all the way through the entire end-to-end consumer journey much more effectively. And so the message and the implication really is clear. Agentic commerce is really not just a nice to have. It can be tied to hard P&L outcomes. Now, roughly 3/4 of retailers said they believe agentic experiences will materially improve customer experience and efficiency in the next few years. That's great. That's a large number. But really only 16% of companies with revenue higher than $5 billion annually are planning to invest more than $10 million. Let that sink in. That number drops to 8% for companies with less than $5 billion in revenue. So what does this tell us? This shows belief is high, but commitment and maybe to some degree readiness is still somewhat more limited. When we compare merchants to consumers, we actually see strong alignment on direction. Interesting. 42% on both sides. And no, this is not a typo or some copy-paste mistake. This is really what the data tells us. 42% expect that agent-driven and agent-mediated commerce would be mainstream by 2030, merchants and consumers. So in other words, merchants are, cautiously optimistic. Consumers are definitely already experimenting. And so there's a window now to shape how this space matures or to let others shape it for you. We'd love to close with some practical learnings and insights from our many conversations on these topics. And we'd love to leave you with 5 actions that we see leading merchants taking right now. First, these merchants are opening their agentic front door. They invite agents to interact with their brand, understand how agents interpret their product catalogs, their pricing, their policies, etc. Second, they bring data to the point of intent. Product availability, loyalty data, etc. need to be accessible wherever decisions are made, via APIs, feeds, emerging standards. If your data is out of date or incomplete or locked somewhere inside a legacy system, brands simply won't show up well in agent-driven journeys. Third, leading merchants are assuring trust and interoperability by adapting to emerging standards, like Google's UCP and A2A. For years, funnily enough, the focus in digital commerce was on keeping bots out. But now we really have to let trusted agent traffic come in. And emerging protocols are really creating a framework for all of us to do that safely. Fourth, leaders need to collaborate and iterate. For example, they take advantage of platforms and standards to accelerate and focus on their unique value add, and they build with high velocity, running tight test and learn cycles. And so agentic experiences should really be products with roadmaps, not projects with end dates. And then finally, and number 5, build the ecosystem. Building all of this alone is hard and frankly impossible. So merchants will need to work with partners of many kinds, creating opportunities for many of you in this room, whether that's in payments, content and review sites, or cloud, of course. Agentic commerce will need many hands to build this trusted ecosystem that everybody will need to rely on. Now, before we open the floor for questions, before we wrap up, let me come back briefly to our 5 main messages from the beginning of this session, just to iterate with all of you again. Number 1, the opportunity is large, $3 to $5 trillion by 2030. Number 2, consumers are delegating research, decision-making, and even some purchasing to agents. The extent still varies by category. Number 3, consumers are moving fast, but at a pace determined by trust. 4, merchants buy the potential, but they have yet to properly invest in the readiness. And then 5, and most importantly, the time to act is now. This will only accelerate.
Let's leave you with just one final thought. A big wave of change in commerce is building as agentically empowered consumers all around the world shift their behaviors.
And in that world, the winners won't just be the ones with the best products. They'll be the merchants that meet the shoppers at the point of intent.
The consumers are ready, the tech is ready.
This is really now an opportunity for all of us to build a trustworthy path to this next era of commerce. Thank you all.